Welcome to Shawn's Thoughts. You're with me, with my thoughts and this remarkable sunset that's occurring right now. You know, it's interesting. Often when I create my frames, I'm always looking to utilize nature. But yet in this frame, this particular one that I'm taking right now, I chose to use that, I guess it's a baseball diamond light off in the far distance with flags which are barely being caught in the wind, but yet a remarkable sky and a remarkable diamond that I'm filming in or filming from. This was actually a diamond that when I was a little kid, we would come here. I don't ever remember the world without this diamond here. Like, my memory doesn't exist without this place, because I first probably came here when I was, really young, and before that I wouldn't remember. And even though that Surrey has dramatically changed population density, everything in Surrey almost changed. So many of the homes that I used to once live in are gone. I was born in Surrey, and my family and we moved through several houses. I mean, many houses, rented houses, throughout our time in Surrey growing up. And now they're all gone. They've all been torn down. Every single house that I've ever lived in, I think, is gone. It's an interesting oddity. Well, obviously, except for the most recent one that I lived in, but I'm talking about all my childhood homes. They're all demolished. And this particular place, is one of the few places that still exist that when I was a child, it existed. So, yeah, that kind of makes this first 2 minutes of this audio today kind of special, I guess. And I'm filming from that baseball diamond. So, yeah, today I kind of want to have an interesting conversation. Not necessarily a conversation. I kind of want to tell a story of things that I've personally learnt about, things that I've researched, and things that I've come to know. And perhaps know of is a better way of discussing it. Because the thing about truth is we don't really know truth is truth. I mean, truly know, and I'm saying know specifically, what truth is truth until it's presented in our reality. And so when I share things that I have come to know or stories that I've heard of, I share them with the idea that my openness to possibilities is ever changing. Hoping perhaps maybe for a better world than the one that I believe to exist. So I'm always keeping myself open so that better world can exist. And therefore, by keeping myself open and knowing it can exist, that it has the potential to exist. And perhaps, one day we'll shift into that timeline where it already exists. And so the story that I kind of want to share, or that I was thinking about as I was walking here, was the story of the Garden of Eden and things that I have come to learn and understand about that particular story. See, we know the story of Adam and Eve being in the Garden of Eden and that whole thing with the apple and being kicked out of the Garden of Eden and being forced into a world perhaps of polarity, duality. See, being in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve would have had a See, I'm just going to let that go by, because really, what's the point? It's such a loud train, I know. I'm saying that to myself. Anyway, so let's get back to the Garden of Eden. So the Garden of Eden, as we knew, was this place of God's choice, essentially. Everything there was so provided as per what I've come to understand that Garden of Eden being for Adam and Eve and, the rest of the Homo sapiens that were there. one of the interesting things I have come to learn that was possible, that was, someone once said, if you want to understand galactic history, read the King James Bible, and instead of using the people's names as names, replace them with peoples. And I don't know if that was races or actual like cities of people or planets of people. I don't really know what that is, but supposedly that's a good way to read that. Here goes that train again. You know, that train is simply the expense that I pay to stand here with you right now in this most historic for me place. Not that I ever played baseball here. I just came here and sat in the bleachers, didn't even care about the baseball game. What I was looking at is when those balls came flying, this particular diamond, it would actually give you $1, I think it was, or it might have been a quarter, but anyways, it was some form of money that I could therefore go buy candy. See, because as a child I didn't have, so I came here hoping to get that pop fly, that out of field hit, and therefore we as children were paid money to go and fetch the ball. And so, yeah, that's kind of why I was here. And so that's the story for me being here. But let's get back to the Garden of Eden. So the Garden of Eden is, as I said, a place where everything's aplenty, where everything that is required is given. And perhaps you could even look at that like what some people believe 5D to be. The 5D is a place where everything that you require is there for you as you need it. That you can essentially, if we look at the Garden of Eden, anything and everything was there. The food, the love, the connection, the abundance. And remember, abundance doesn't mean to be rich. Abundance, for me anyways, means that you have everything when you need it at the moment that you need it. And you are never in want. And to be in want is to be in lack. See, that's one of the interesting things that we never got taught, that we manifest our reality and we do it with our words, and or did it with our words, hopefully. And when we said things like, I want, enter item here, enter thing here, enter person here, that was heard as a statement of lack, that I lack this, and we're focusing, therefore, when we're focusing on our wants, we're focusing on our lacks, the things we lack. And I don't mean just the occasional desire, I mean always wanting something. Always wanting more money, for example, would mean that you lack money, and so therefore occurrences of lacking money would come into your field, perhaps. But anyways, we get back to the idea of the Garden of Eden, and that perhaps this was a place that was like that. And it was a world or a variation or a version or an older existence of a world that did exist here on our planet. And that we were creators or experiencers of living that world. And that something happened which casted out Adam and Eve, or like I said, if you subscribe to that idea that the King James Version of the Bible, perhaps Adam and Eve represent two races or two genders, perhaps. But anyways, the whole idea of the Garden of Eden is that these beings lived there as per what our texts say, and then they were casted out. Well, one of the things that I've come to understand is that the Garden of Eden, at least the biblical one that we are aware of, perhaps was in between Iraq and Iran. That's something that I was come to understood, or at least perhaps one of the Garden of Edens, if there were multiple, but the one that maybe we talk about in the texts could have perhaps came from that area. Or, you know, I'm saying it's skeptical, but that resonates with me somehow. And so anyways, that's what I've come to understand, is that the waters that came from the Garden of Eden, those sprang from the area that those sprang from those waters, those living waters perhaps, that they came from the area in between Iraq and Iran. And interestingly enough, when I showed this area to a friend of mine who herself was from Iran, she had essentially identified the area that I was talking about as an area that she knew of when she was a child, and they would go there to collect water, and that the water had healing properties, like it was something that they believed in their group of people. I don't know if it's a village, town, city, or whatever she's from, but nonetheless that the people that she went believed that. And so that kind of validated when I heard that the Garden of Eden's springs, perhaps a couple years ago, maybe September a couple years ago, those waters started springing again, and they started releasing living water back into the water cycle on our planet. And yeah, that's an amazing story, and it leads to other stories that I've come across that I can connect when it comes to the Garden of Eden. That the Garden of Eden perhaps is our entire planet. Perhaps our entire planet was once a Garden of Eden, a place of paradise, a place of plenty. And that perhaps being casted out of the Garden of Eden is losing that place of plenty and being forced down into a higher density where things are more challenging, they're more solid, they're more, you can't change them as much. And perhaps the Garden of Eden is returning paradise back to earth in the form that it once was, perhaps once when and before Adam and Eve. And then yeah, and then I start going off into other ideas of who perhaps were the actual characters within that story. I've just had an idea come through my head, but I'll leave that for another day. Because, yeah. And so, living water that I previously spoke of, from how I've come to see that, is very similar to celery juice, to the water that exists in celery juice. That somehow there are certain ingredients that are found in celery juice, sodium cluster salts, for example, and very highly bioavailable vitamin C. And those things, along with other nutrients perhaps, they truly help the body. And this living water that I'm talking about, the way that I believe the medical medium described it in his books, I saw it as the same thing, the same living water that perhaps was coming out of that spring. And that water 2 years ago started to spring again, or maybe 3, but already by now that water is within our table, within our water table, circulating throughout our planet. And that would be completely amazing, but, well, not but. However, I feel I've seen it. I've seen it in trees that are very plentiful with their fruit, almost sometimes falling off the tree. I've seen trees with so much fruit that just appear suddenly overnight that they're leaning into the street, that they all had to be cut way back. And I walked past fruit trees that had never fruited, or at least I had never perceived them to fruit. And fruiting mean that, fruit, ripe fruit coming off. And this fruit, which started happening last summer very quickly, not overnight, but that's when I noticed it. And then the pears would start falling off in abundance. And so for me, things like that exemplify the fact that perhaps this water is already in our system. And then, you go on to the idea that perhaps our perspectives, or our perceptions, more important actually, properly said, our perceptions perhaps have been skewed in some way, that this stuff was always there. So many fruits off of trees, but yet we didn't see it because we were unable to see it. Or we saw a lower version of that plant that just didn't fruit, or we didn't see it fruit. I know that's going a little off the deep end, but yeah, so that's how I've that's a short talk on the Garden of Eden. Yeah, I don't know if there's so much to do with history, and I think the reason why knowing our history is important is because it enhances our awareness. And perhaps I've spoken to this point a lot when it came on to podcasts and audios, because I've always believed that one of the pillars of essentially what my channel is all about is it's about sharing awareness. I'm aware that the train is coming. And so I express that I'm realizing that I have spoke a lot about this, but I guess some reason I'm called to do it again, because if we are moving in through a large transition, awareness is growing. But learning about stuff, about the things that have happened, the reasons for atrocities and, reasons overall, and who did it and done what, being and becoming aware of that stuff, well, extremely important, because that's what allows us to know the trauma was there so we can release it. If we're not aware of the problem, then you really can't let go of the trauma. It is possible in certain cases, I guess, with things like TFT in my experience, but most of the times you have to be aware of the trauma and then go through the releasing process, the forgiving process, the letting go process, however you view it. And that is most cases unable to happen until we become aware. So that's how I see the channel that I have created, is just to share the awareness that I've come aware to myself. And I say as awareness because it's awareness of these possibilities. See, as I've said before, there's something strange in the neighborhood. Who are you going to call? We need to know the truth. So, truth busters or lie busters. Yeah, lie busters. And by openly getting into discussions of the possibility of these things, it allows it to be a possibility. And not necessarily in a bad way, but in a possibility that these things could be happening, things that we weren't aware of, no matter where our ego and our pride takes us, that we weren't aware of, that have been affecting us in a negative way. And even if it's been happening our whole entire lives, which is challenging. It's challenging to be in the system and to break out. You think of the movie Matrix, of how challenging it was for Neo or Trinity when they were breaking out into the physical world, and they had those feelings of, loss of the place that they were in. They also had the feelings of, the physical issues, the pain, and the realization of their whole world was completely different. It perhaps doesn't have to be like that it won't be like that, I would guess, for some people. Some people, as things change in our world, are simply going to be like, oh, okay, well, I kind of knew that was coming. And they're going to transition in easier. But those people have been doing this, like the awakening part, the inner healing, the releasing the emotional traumas and guilts and shames that they had towards the system. They've been doing that for a little while. And although, traumas have been built up in just living life, they've been more studied at releasing those traumas. And so therefore, even traumas that we have going forward that some would perceive as traumas, they've had the endurance race already to strengthen their resilience. And, resilience simply just means you're not being affected the same way, and a considerable resilience boost. So I thought I would throw that out there about the awareness, because a lot of times some people, and I don't know if it's